My name is Sarah Calloway. I'm 37 years old, and I want to tell you about the night my husband's entire family sat in a hotel ballroom, raised their glasses to celebrate him, and didn't notice that I was the only person in the room who knew the whole thing was about to fall apart. I remember exactly where I was sitting. Third from the end, on the left side of the long rectangular table. Not at the center, where my husband Daniel stood giving a speech. Not next to his mother, Margaret, who had claimed the seat beside him almost before the waitstaff had finished arranging the chairs. I was at the edge, which, if I'm honest, was exactly where I had been for most of our marriage. The occasion was Daniel's promotion to regional director at Halcyon Property Group. 15 years of working in real estate development, and he had finally reached the title his mother had been announcing to relatives for at least 3 of those years, as if it had already happened. Margaret stood up before Daniel even finished speaking. She tapped her glass. She said, "This family has always known what Daniel was capable of. Some people doubted, but we never did." She looked at me when she said some people doubted. Not long, just a second, but the table was small enough that the people closest to her caught it. I picked up my water glass and took a slow sip. If you've ever been publicly dismissed in a room full of people who pretended not to notice, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. Because that feeling, calm on the outside, everything tilting on the inside, is something you don't forget. Daniel and I had been married for 8 years. We met when I was 26, and working as a mid-level analyst at a land acquisition consultancy. He was charming, ambitious, and genuinely funny in those early years. I believed in him before most people did, including, honestly, himself. What I didn't understand until much later was that Margaret had a very specific idea of what I was supposed to be in her son's life. A support structure, quiet, capable, grateful, and invisible in equal measure. She was never cruel in ways that were easy to name. She didn't insult me directly. She was polished. She would ask about my work with a particular kind of half-attention, the way you half-listen to someone giving you directions you don't intend to follow. She would then pivot immediately to Daniel's career, his stress, his potential, the sacrifices he was making. His sister, Joanna, was the same. Joanna had married well, which in Margaret's vocabulary meant she had married a man with a title and a visible salary, and had subsequently stopped working, which was presented as a lifestyle choice and never questioned. Joanna would look at me at family dinners with something between pity and performance. She once said, in the kitchen, while I was helping clean up and she was watching me do it, "I don't know how you manage with such a demanding job. I'd be exhausted." She said it gently. She meant it as a reduction. Then there was Daniel's younger brother, Callum. Callum worked peripherally in the property industry, nothing senior, but he spoke about the industry with enormous authority. He had recently started bringing documents to family dinners. Proposals, as he called them. Ideas he wanted Daniel to consider. He would slide them across the table, with the ease of someone who had long decided that the table belonged to him. What nobody at that table knew was that I had spent the previous 2 years quietly saving Daniel's career. Not dramatically, not loudly, in the way women like me often do things, completely invisibly. Let me go back a little. 18 months before the hotel ballroom dinner, Daniel had made a serious error in judgment on a mid-scale commercial development outside the city. He had approved a zoning interpretation that his team flagged as borderline. He had pushed it through anyway because the timeline was tight and the commission was significant. When the zoning issue was raised by the local council, the deal nearly collapsed. Daniel came home that night looking like a different person. He sat at the kitchen table and didn't speak for almost an hour. I worked in land compliance. I had for 12 years. I understood zoning law, council dispute processes, and remediation pathways better than most people Daniel had ever worked with. I spent the following 6 weeks working through the problem with him, off the books, from our kitchen table. I drafted the remediation proposal. I identified the precedent cases. I formatted the submission to the council in language I knew from experience they would respond to. The issue was resolved. The development proceeded. Daniel received internal recognition for handling a difficult situation professionally. His path to regional director cleared significantly after that. He thanked me. He did. Once, privately, the night the approval came through. He said he couldn't have done it without me. He never mentioned it again. And I never brought it up. By the time the promotion dinner came around, I don't think Daniel consciously remembered how close that situation had come to ending differently. Memory is convenient like that. We remember the outcome, we forget the scaffold. The dinner itself was fine, in the way that obligatory celebrations are fine. The food was good, the speeches ran long. Margaret told a story about Daniel as a boy that she had told at least 4 times in my presence, and everyone laughed as though it were new. Callum, halfway through the main course, slid a folded document across to Daniel. He said he'd been working on something, a proposal to bring Callum into Daniel's new regional team, in an advisory capacity. Daniel hadn't mentioned this to me. I watched his face when he opened it. He hadn't been expecting it either. Margaret said, immediately, "It makes sense to keep things in the family." Joanna nodded. I looked at the document from where I sat. I could see enough of it to notice that Callum's proposed role overlapped significantly with a compliance advisory structure I had actually helped design for Daniel's division 6 months earlier. My name was not in those documents because I had contributed informally, through Daniel. But my framework was there, my language, my structure, the risk mitigation sequence I had built from scratch. Callum was proposing to be paid for work that was built on a foundation I had laid for free. I didn't say anything. I folded my napkin. I excused myself and went to the restroom. I stood at the sink for about 3 minutes. I ran cold water over my wrists, which I do when I need to think clearly. Then I looked at myself in the mirror and made a quiet decision. I was done being invisible. I had a meeting the following Tuesday with a woman named Dr. Elaine Marsh. She was the head of the Independent Compliance Review Panel for the Regional Property Authority. We had known each other professionally for 4 years. She had approached me 6 weeks earlier about a formal advisory role on an upcoming regulatory review. I had been considering it quietly. I hadn't mentioned it to Daniel because I hadn't decided yet. After the dinner, I called her Monday morning and accepted. The role was paid, formal, and carried a title. More importantly, it carried access. The regulatory review she was leading covered exactly the class of commercial development that Daniel's division specialized in. Any firm operating in that space during the review period would need to demonstrate compliance with the new framework, which I would help author. I told Daniel that evening, calmly, over dinner. I said I had accepted a position on a regulatory advisory panel. He looked up. "What panel?" I told him. He put his fork down. "That covers our region." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "You didn't mention you were being considered for that." "You didn't mention Callum's proposal either," I said. Not sharply, just evenly. He didn't have an answer for that. Over the next 3 weeks, I learned things in my new role that clarified everything. The regulatory review had identified 3 areas of concern in recent regional development activity. One of them related directly to informal advisory relationships, where unqualified parties had been brought into compliance-adjacent roles without proper credentialing. Callum's proposed role, I recognized immediately, would have fallen into exactly that category. If Daniel had accepted it and Callum had begun operating in that capacity, the division would have had a compliance exposure during the review period that could have had serious consequences. I documented this in a formal memo through my advisory role. It wasn't targeted. It was part of my standard review contribution. I flagged the pattern without naming any specific firm. The framework made it clear what would constitute a risk. Dr. Marsh read my memo in a meeting with 3 other panel members. She looked at me over the table and said, "This is exactly the kind of structural analysis we needed. This will likely become the core of the guidance document." I said thank you and wrote the next section. The guidance document was published 5 weeks later. It went to every major property firm in the region. Halcyon's legal team flagged it internally within 48 hours. Daniel called me from his office at 2 in the afternoon, which he almost never did. He said, "The legal team is saying we may have a compliance gap, something related to advisory roles." I said, "I know." He paused. "You know?" "I helped write the framework." Another pause. Longer this time. He came home early that evening. He sat in the kitchen, in the same chair he had sat in the night. The zoning issue came to a head. I made tea. I put a cup in front of him. He said, "If we'd brought Callum in, you'd have had a formal compliance exposure during a regulatory review period." I said, "It would have been reviewed by a panel I sit on." He looked at me. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I thought about the hotel ballroom. Margaret's glass raised. Some people doubted. The look in her eyes directed at me. I said, I wasn't sure you were listening. He didn't argue, which told me something. Margaret called me 4 days later. The call was unusual. She rarely called me directly. She called Daniel, and then Daniel relayed information to me like a dispatch service. Her voice was careful. She said she had heard I was involved in the regulatory work. She said it sounded very significant. She asked, very particularly, whether the advisory structure issue would affect firms that had already moved forward with internal hiring. I told her, gently, that I couldn't discuss specifics of the review with interested parties. I said it the same way I would say it to anyone. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, You've always been very dedicated to your work, Sarah. It was the first time she had ever said my name at the start of a sentence. I noticed it. I said, Thank you, Margaret, and ended the call. Callum's proposal was quietly withdrawn the following week. Daniel told me over breakfast. He said it carefully, watching my face. I nodded and poured my coffee. Joanna sent me a text the same day. It said, Daniel's lucky to have someone like you in his corner. I read it twice. Then I put my phone face down and finished my breakfast. I want to be honest about what happened after that, because it wasn't a clean ending. Daniel and I had a long and difficult series of conversations over the following months. Not loud ones. Quiet, careful, sometimes painful conversations about what our marriage had actually looked like from the inside, and whether either of us had been truly present in it. He said, during one of them, that he thought he had taken the easier path for years, that when his family needed someone to underestimate, I had been the available candidate, and he had allowed it, because correcting it would have required a confrontation he didn't want to have. I said I understood that. I also said it wasn't something I could continue to absorb. We separated in the spring. Not dramatically. Not with lawyers at dawn. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I had helped save his career twice without recognition, and we made a list of what needed to happen practically. It was one of the most civilized conversations we'd ever had. I moved into a flat in a neighborhood I had always liked but we had never lived in because it didn't suit Daniel's image of where people like them lived. It was smaller. The kitchen window faced east and caught the morning light properly. I kept my role on the advisory panel. The guidance document I helped write became a regional standard. Dr. Marsh mentioned my contribution in a published acknowledgement. My name, in print, without anyone else's attached to it. Margaret never called again. Joanna sent a card at Christmas. I sent one back. Callum I haven't spoken to. People sometimes ask if I regret the years I spent making myself smaller. I've thought about that honestly. I don't think I regret loving Daniel. I don't think I regret the work I did, even the invisible parts. The zoning remediation, the compliance framework, the kitchen table hours. That work was real. It helped real people. It mattered, regardless of whether anyone acknowledged it. What I regret is the silence I kept about my own value. Not the professional silence, that was sometimes strategically necessary. The other kind, the social silence. The way I sat at the edge of tables and didn't say, actually, I built part of what you're celebrating tonight. That silence wasn't humility. It was a habit I had grown so used to that I had stopped examining it. I examine it now. I still work in compliance. It's not glamorous. Nobody films it for social media. But there is something deeply satisfying about work that requires precision, patience, and an absolute refusal to pretend something is clean when it isn't. I have a small team of junior analysts. I tell them, when we start a new review cycle, that our job is not to catch the error after it's caused damage. Our job is to make the environment honest enough that the damage doesn't happen. I tell them documentation is not bureaucracy, it is protection. Not just for the firm, for yourselves. They write it down. I think about my father when I say it. He was the kind of man who kept carbon copies of everything. Not because he was suspicious of people, because he understood that good work deserves a record. He was right. Mine exists. Quiet, specific,